Hello everyone. Tonight, before we drift into our quiet little corner of history, let me welcome you back to this soft, dimly lit space where stories breathe slowly and the past curls gently around the edges of our imagination. If you are listening from your bed, or maybe from a cozy chair in a room that smells faintly of evening tea, I hope you are comfortable. And if you are just settling in, take a breath long, steady, and peaceful. Because tonight's story is one of those secret chapters history rarely reads aloud. A chapter wrapped in velvet shadows, hushed corridors, and the quiet strength of people who learned to survive by becoming experts in subtlety. So let us begin. Imagine a world covered in gold dust and heavy curtains. A world of chandeliers, manor houses, private carriages, and polished floors that echo a little too loudly whenever someone walks past. A world where rules are not written on paper but stitched into the fabric of your clothes, encoded in your posture, and whispered into your ear from the moment you are old enough to sit upright at a formal dinner. This was royal life in the early 1900s. And for those who carried a truth they could not speak, is a life built entirely on secrecy. In most history books, royalty is painted in broad strokes: crowns, duties, public appearances, treaties, marriages, and portraits that look like everyone in them has been holding their breath for about 3 centuries. But behind those portraits, behind those carefully arranged expressions, were real people living under an immense weight. And some of those people belonged to a group history often softened, erased, or simply overlooked. Individuals whose hearts did not follow the path expected of them. Individuals who lived quietly and cautiously, not because they lacked courage, but because everything around them demanded invisibility. To understand what that meant, we have to step through those palace doors and feel the air on the other side, the stillness, the expectations, the sense that every room watches you, because the secret lives of low BQ plus roles in the early 20th century were not shaped by dramatic scandals or bold public declarations. They were shaped by the exact opposite: silence. A silence so deep and so refined that it became almost an art form. A silence practiced at breakfast tables, in opera boxes, during carriage rides, on garden paths, and under the ever-present gaze of staff trained to observe everything without ever appearing to look. Let us start at the very beginning of an ordinary royal day, a day that would feel anything but ordinary to someone carrying a truth that must never slip out. Morning light falls softly through layers of embroidered curtains, painting the room in a pale glow. The sheets beneath you are crisp, cool, and impossibly smooth. Outside your door, someone is already moving quietly, preparing for the moment you awaken. And before you have even stretched your arms, before your feet have touched the rug, before your thoughts have fully arrived, you remember the one rule that governs your entire life. Everything must look perfect. Perfect posture, perfect answers, perfect control. And so the act begins. A valet enters. His eyes land not on you but on the far wall. That polite, disciplined blindness is part of the job. Yet even without looking directly at you, he notices everything: the slightly disheveled pillow, the faint trace of a late-night return, the way your robe is thrown over a chair instead of folded neatly. Small details, all of them. But in this world, small things speak loudly. You say good morning, steady and calm, the kind of good morning someone gives when they have absolutely nothing to hide, even if the truth is that they spent half the night wide awake, rehearsing the face they will wear at breakfast. He sets down a tray of poached eggs and tea, always the same, always precise, and you eat with rehearsed elegance, because in this household, even the way you hold your fork is a symbol of the family's reputation. One clink too many, one hesitation too long, and it becomes a topic of discussion somewhere, somehow, among people trained to notice anything unusual. But beneath that delicate surface, a deeper narrative unfolds. Breakfast is not really breakfast. It is a performance. Every sip, every polite nod, every ounce of composure says, I'm steady. I am exactly what you expect me to be. And that is the burden. For a royal in the 1900s who was secretly gay, the world was not merely conservative, it was tightly sealed, controlled, and unforgiving. Public image was not just important. It was everything. Family lineage was more than blood. It was destiny. Marriage was not a choice. It was an obligation. And affection, the genuine kind, born from the heart rather than the rule book, was something that had to be smuggled through life like contraband. Imagine carrying a truth so delicate that even a misplaced glance during breakfast could put you at risk. Laugh held a second too long, a compliment that slips out too warmly, a name you mention too often. Here, emotional expression was not simply discouraged. It was regulated, monitored by mothers, aunts, cousins, servants, advisors, and even the ghost-like expectations of ancestors whose portraits lined the hallways. The palace was a home, yes, but it was also an echo chamber of expectations. Every room had eyes, every corridor had ears, and every tradition whispered the same message: do not break the illusion. Yet despite all of that, despite the weight, the risks, the suffocating pressure, there were still moments of quiet bravery. Little rebellions disguised as ordinary life. A garden walk that lingers a bit too long. A shared smile across a music room. A conversation wrapped in coded language only two people understand. A letter written at 3 folded carefully, then hidden away because sending it would be too dangerous. This was not a life of grand gestures. It was a life in cautious steps toward authenticity in a world that allowed almost none. And that is why their stories feel so human. Because while kings and queens often appear larger than life in our imagination, these individuals lived a form of vulnerability more relatable than any battle or political treaty. They knew loneliness intimately. They knew fear intimately. But they also knew resilience intimately, the ability to navigate each day with a grace that masked the storm underneath. Survive. They became experts in subtlety, masters of coded communication, champions of polite evasion. Their secret lives were woven so seamlessly into the fabric of royal etiquette that, from the outside, it looked like nothing unusual at all. And that, perhaps, is the most heartbreaking part. So tonight, as we walk gently into this story, imagine not just the royal halls and the polished silverware. Imagine the emotional architecture beneath it, all the private worlds hidden behind polite nods, modest smiles, and perfectly tied cravats. Imagine living in a palace that glitters with gold, but offers very little freedom. Imagine holding your breath through every season, every gathering, every whispered rumor, every prayer that nothing unusual slips through. Tonight's story is not about scandal. It is about survival. It is about people who lived in a time that gave them no permission to be themselves, yet they still found ways, quiet, subtle, beautiful ways to love, to hope, to dream, and to leave traces of themselves in a world determined to silence them. So get comfortable. Let the soft glow of this moment wrap around you. And together, let us walk through the hidden world of the royals who live their truths in whispers, and whose courage, though quiet, deserves to be remembered. If the morning began with a breath held behind the ribs, then the rest of the day unfolded like a carefully choreographed play, one so familiar, so polished, so endlessly rehearsed that even the performers sometimes forgot where the acting ended and where the truth began. For a royal in the early 1900s, carrying a hidden identity, each hour of the day was not just part of a schedule. It was a script they were required to follow, line by line, gesture by gesture, without a single stumble. After breakfast, after the polite nods, the delicate handling of teacups, the measured conversation chosen with the precision of a practiced diplomat, came the first round of engagements. Meetings with advisors, walks through manicured gardens with visiting dignitaries, public appearances where the light was always just a bit too bright and the air always a touch too formal. Every moment demanded a version of yourself that felt slightly removed, slightly polished, slightly coated in something invisible yet heavy. Imagine stepping outside your room not as yourself, but as the role expected of you. Shoulders back, chin lifted just enough, hands at ease but never too relaxed, expression gentle but unreadable. The silent rule was simple. Appear calm, appear confident, and above all else, appear aligned with what everyone believes you to be. And so the performance continued. In the garden, where sunshine warmed the gravel paths and roses leaned softly over their stems, you might walk beside a relative who asked cheerful questions about your future, questions about politics, travel, or marriage, questions that carried invisible hooks. You would smile and answer with the same well-rehearsed lines, words that had been repeated so often they no longer belonged to you. Your voice floated easily, light and steady, giving nothing away, giving never too much. The staff followed at a distance, far enough to be respectful but close enough to hear if anything important was said. And they never intruded, but they never disappeared either. Their presence was a reminder that in the royal world, solitude was a luxury almost no one truly had. There were always eyes, always footsteps echoing somewhere nearby, always someone ready to step forward if needed. The role you played was not just for the public, it was for them too. Every gesture, Even the most mundane had meaning. Picking up a book in the library, pausing to admire a painting, leaning over a balcony railing to watch the carriages arrive. None of it was seen as simple or private. Every detail could become a conversation topic. Every habit could become a curiosity among staff or relatives. And when your truth was something that had to stay hidden, even those small choices became part of a larger strategy. Conversations required even more skill. In royal circles, conversation was often a kind of dance, layers of politeness covering layers of implication, with every word brushed clean of anything that might raise questions. Someone might casually mention a visiting noble's daughter, or the importance of continuing the family line. They might hint at expectations wrapped in velvet, expectations they believed you shared. And you, with the grace of someone who has practiced this dance since childhood, would smile softly, offer a neutral answer, then guide the conversation to safer ground. Not too quickly, not too obviously, just enough to avoid lingering on topics that made the walls feel closer. The truth is that daily life required a constant awareness of what others saw or thought they saw. Even the way you responded to jokes, or the way you avoided certain subjects, or the way your eyes briefly lingered on someone, they all mattered in this world. Something as small as a warm reaction to a certain name could spark curiosity that took on a life of its own. So you learned to master neutrality, not coldness, neutrality. A quiet, sophisticated middle ground where nothing too revealing ever slipped through. A smile that was gentle but never too personal. A laugh that was soft but never too knowing. A comment that was thoughtful but never intimate. But the hardest performances were the ones held behind closed doors. Inside the palace, the schedule flowed from meetings to fittings to planning sessions for ceremonies months away. Advisors would arrive with folders and proposals, and you would sit in rooms lined with portraits of ancestors who had lived by the same rigid code. Their eyes, painted centuries ago, felt like part of the audience. They watched as you nodded through presentations, offered sensible opinions, and behaved precisely as a future monarch or noble was expected to behave. And perhaps, while listening to a discussion about foreign relations or agricultural policies or the annual charity gala, your mind drifted to something else entirely. A memory, a person, a moment from the night before, a brief spark of emotion that felt entirely out of place in a room filled with polished tables and ceremonial documents. But you would catch yourself, pull your thoughts back, straighten your expression, resume the role. Every moment demanded a certain kind of stillness, a restraint so constant it began to feel like the natural way of breathing. You did not even realize how often you monitored yourself, how often you checked your tone, your posture, your eyes, how often you tucked away any impulse that was not fully aligned with the version of you the palace expected. Afternoons were not much easier. Public outings, charity visits, tea with important families, or rehearsals for upcoming events. These were the times when the performance felt the most intense, because the world outside the palace walls loved watching royalty even more than those inside. Newspapers waited for any unusual expression, any unexpected gesture, any story that could be spun just enough to sell. And so, once again, you became a symbol instead of a person. Your presence had to be serene. Your smile had to be effortless. Your interactions had to appear natural but never too warm, friendly but never too familiar. You were expected to embody dignity while being pleasant, to be poised without appearing distant, to be impressive without showing strain. It was a delicate balance, and no matter how practiced you were, it was exhausting. But perhaps the most emotional part of the day came in the quiet hours, not quite evening, not quite night, when you finally slipped away from the last engagement, removed the heavy layers of clothing, and allowed yourself a moment to breathe without the weight of expectation pressing down. Even then, the performance did not fully fade. Someone might knock. Someone might need something. A relative might call you to discuss plans. A servant might bring a message. And so the role continued, gentler now but still present. Always present, always lingering like a second skin. Because in this world, the performance was not just something you did. It was something you became. If the day itself was a performance, then the clothing worn throughout it was the costume carefully selected, deliberately arranged, and subtly powerful in ways most people outside the palace would never notice. In the royal world of the early 1900s, garments were more than decoration. They were declarations. They told stories. They concealed truths. They offered protection. And for someone living with a secret identity, each layer of fabric became another layer of armor. Imagine walking into that grand dressing room each morning. Sunlight slips through tall windows and glances off polished mirrors, turning the air into a soft haze. Valets move quietly, their hands gentle and practiced as they lay out the day's choices. Crisp shirts, finely tailored jackets, ties folded with perfect symmetry, waistcoats embroidered so subtly that only an expert would understand their full meaning. It was a silent language, one spoken through textures and colors and the careful decision of which piece to wear on which occasion. To the public, clothes were a symbol of elegance. To the palace, they were a symbol of status. But to someone carrying a private truth, they became something far more intimate. They were a shield. The first layer, usually a soft linen shirt, carried a particular kind of symbolism. It rested closest to the skin, quiet and unassuming, yet it provided the foundation for everything else. You could almost pretend, for a moment, while buttoning it, that this was the one piece still untouched by the outside world's expectations. It felt simple, grounded, human. But the moment you added the waistcoat, the illusion shifted. A waistcoat was structure. It shaped the posture, smoothed the silhouette, and reinforced an identity expected of royalty. Proper, composed, controlled. It hugged the body in a way that reminded you of your place, straight lines, firm edges, no softness showing. Every stitch echoed the same message: hide what does not fit the mold. Then came the jacket, a masterpiece of tailoring. The weight of it settled across the shoulders like responsibility itself. Tailors in those days understood their clients with startling accuracy. They knew exactly how to shape a garment to make someone appear taller, stronger, broader, more authoritative. They understood which angles disguised tension, which cuts softened a frame, which patterns directed attention away from the eyes and toward the clothing. The jacket was not just clothing, it was a tool, a device that made the world see what it expected to see. And of course, there was the tie. To anyone else, a tie was simply part of the outfit. But to someone navigating a life of secrets, it became a tiny battlefield of expression. Color choices mattered. Patterns mattered. A tie that was too bold raised questions. A tie that was too soft invited assumptions. So the ties chosen were almost always refined, never too daring, designed to blend in with the overall look of conformity. Even the way it was knotted tight, clean, precise carried meaning. A slightly loose knot could be interpreted as carelessness. A flawless knot suggested discipline. And discipline was safer. The shoes, polished so carefully they reflected the ceiling beams, completed the look. Their shine was not for vanity. It was a form of proof evidence that everything was in order, that nothing in your presentation slipped. Even the smallest scuff could draw a raised eyebrow from a relative who believed appearance reflected character. But perhaps the most powerful element of the wardrobe was not the clothing itself. It was the transformation that happened once all of it was on. Because standing there buttoned, smooth, aligned, you no longer looked like the person who whispered honest thoughts into a diary at midnight. You did not look like the person who felt a flutter of warmth when a certain someone entered a room. You did not look like the person who wished, quietly, deeply, for the simple freedom to be known. You looked like the role, and looking like the role made it easier to play the role. Clothes, in this world, were not meant to reflect who you were. They were designed to mask it. They softened anything too unconventional. They sharpened anything too vulnerable. They created the illusion of a life without conflict, a heart without struggle. And the longer you wore them, the more that illusion settled into the bones. Even accessories became part of this concealment. A watch with an engraved family crest reminded you of duty. Cufflinks with the initials of an ancestor whispered tradition every time you moved your wrist. A pocket square folded into a perfect triangle became one more symbol of precision, and one more signal to others that everything about you fit neatly into expectation. But the truth, hidden beneath the fabric, was far more intricate. Underneath the layers, you felt the weight of everything you could not show. You carried emotions that needed to be tucked away like loose threads. You carried desires you were not allowed to speak. You carried dreams that were not meant for someone in your position. And so the clothing did the work for you. It hid the tremble in your hands, the risks in your choices, the softness in your expression. It allowed you to walk through rooms filled with scrutiny without revealing a single crack. And yet, there were moments, small ones, when the clothing betrayed its own purpose. Perhaps it happened in the mirror, when the jacket settled just a little too perfectly, making you feel like a character you did not recognize. Or in the way the collar pressed against your neck, slightly too tight, reminding you that authenticity had to be kept beneath the first layer. Or in the way your reflection looked back at you, composed and regal, while the person inside felt like a quiet storm. Sometimes, in those rare private moments, you would loosen the tie, unbutton the waistcoat, and feel an unexpected wave of relief. Not because the clothing was uncomfortable, but because without it, you felt closer to the person you actually were. Someone softer, someone warmer, someone who existed beyond the stage. But even that small freedom never lasted long. Someone would knock. Someone would need you. A meeting would begin. A duty would call. And once again, the armor would return to its place. Because in the royal world of the early 20th century, clothing was not just fabric. It was identity. It was strategy. It was survival. It was the quiet art of becoming invisible in plain sight or visible in the exact way others needed you to be. And for a royal living with a secret truth, clothing became the most reliable companion of all. It never questioned. It never judged. It simply protected what the world was not ready to see. If clothing served as armor and daily routines became a performance, then family was the audience that watched most closely, an audience that never blinked, never forgot, and never stopped interpreting every subtle shift in your behavior. Living inside a royal family in the early 1900s meant that privacy was not something you owned. It was something granted to you in tiny, momentary fragments, usually by accident. The rest of your life unfolded under the constant gaze of people who believed they knew you better than you knew yourself. Family meals, for example, were not simply gatherings. They were examinations. A breakfast table lined with polished silverware and perfectly folded napkins held an unspoken kind of intensity. Relatives, mothers with sharp intuition, aunts with gentle but probing eyes, uncles with rigid expectations observed you with a quiet, relentless attentiveness. Every gesture, every choice of topic, every glance meant something to them. Even your silence meant something. A mother might watch the way you lifted your cup. Was your hand steady? Did you hesitate before answering a question? Did you seem indifferent when she casually mentioned someone she thought would be a suitable match? Her smile remained warm, but her mind catalogued every detail, smoothing them into a pattern that either comforted or concerned her. You would respond with that polished calm you would mastered so well. A gentle laugh, a light remark, a thoughtful nod. Enough to appear fully present, not enough to invite deeper questions. It was a delicate equation, one you solved over and over, at every meal, in every conversation. The palace, for all its grandeur, was not built for secrets. The walls carried voices too easily. Corridors stretched like veins through the entire structure, allowing whispers to travel farther than anyone intended. And family, with their generations of practice in reading subtlety, could detect tension the way others detect temperature. Relatives did not need to ask direct questions. They only needed to observe. They noticed if your mood changed after a certain name was mentioned. They noticed if you leaned forward during one conversation more than another. They noticed if you avoided eye contact with someone, or if you lingered too long in a particular room, or if you excused yourself from the table slightly earlier than usual. Even innocence became suspicious in the wrong context. There were times when an aunt might tilt her head, studying your face with that gentle, knowing warmth that felt both comforting and dangerous. She might tell you that you looked thoughtful lately, or preoccupied, or different. She would not say what she suspected because even she did not dare think the full thought, but she would observe you with an attentiveness that made your skin tighten beneath your clothing. Family traditions amplified the scrutiny. Garden walks, Sunday church services, evening teas in sitting rooms filled with soft lamplight and floral upholstery. Each moment felt like a new stage, a new chapter in a silent investigation you never agreed to be part of. Conversations drifted effortlessly from weather to politics to the future of the family, and woven into those pleasant topics were threads of expectation. You will make a wonderful husband one day, someone might say, their smile gentle but loaded. We must think about your position, another would add, as though your future were a tapestry they alone understood how to weave. And you held together by poise, strengthened by practice, would smile and say something appropriately polite, something so neutral it practically evaporated after being spoken, something that allowed the moment to move on without leaving too much behind. But beneath all that elegance lived a quiet truth. Family could hurt you without meaning to, not out of cruelty, but out of their fierce devotion to tradition. Their love was genuine, yet it was a love shaped by rules older than any of them, rules that dictated what a royal life should look like. They were not trying to expose you. They were trying to protect the family, the name, the lineage, the image crafted over centuries. They believed they were helping, and that, in some ways, made their scrutiny even more suffocating. You learned to carry your emotions like fragile glass. You learned to hold them in a way that did not catch the light too strongly. You became skilled at smoothing your expression the moment you felt something bloom too brightly inside your chest. You trained your voice to remain steady even when your thoughts felt turbulent. Family could tell if something was wrong but not what, and you worked tirelessly to keep it that way. The evenings were no easier. After dinner, when everyone gathered in sitting rooms to enjoy soft music or quiet conversation, the atmosphere shifted into something more intimate and therefore more dangerous. With the world outside already dark, people seemed to look more closely, talk more softly, pay more attention. A cousin might tease you gently, watching your reaction to see whether you laughed like yourself or like someone trying too hard. A grandmother might squeeze your hand a bit longer than usual, murmuring that she hoped you were happy. That one word, happy, echoed in your mind long after the moment passed. Happiness was complicated for someone who lived in two realities at once. The one you showed, the one you hid. Even the safest questions sometimes felt sharp. How are you? How have you been feeling? Are you excited about the upcoming season? In another life, those questions would be simple. In yours, they felt like tests. And yet, in the middle of all that scrutiny, there were moments tiny, fleeting, delicate when someone in the family gave you a glance that felt different. A glance that said they knew more than they let on. A glance filled not with suspicion, but with quiet understanding. They never spoke it aloud. They never asked. They just softened, in the way certain people do when they love you enough to let you keep your secrets. Those moments meant everything, but they were rare as cracks in marble. And once they passed, the watchfulness returned, gentle but unyielding. Because in the royal world, love and pressure lived in the same room. Tradition and concern walked hand in hand. And family, no matter how affectionate, held the power to shape your entire future with a single assumption, a single fear, a single whisper that reached the wrong ear. So you learned to navigate them with the same skill you used everywhere else, with poise, with caution, with grace. You let them see what they needed to see, but never more. You let them believe you're calm, even when your heart beat too quickly. You let their expectations flow around you, without letting them swallow you. And through it all, you held on to the quiet truth inside yourself, guarding it like a fragile flame in a room full of drafts. Because family scrutiny was not just something you lived with. It was something you survived, day after day, smile after smile, until it became part of the rhythm of your life. If family watched you with the fierce devotion of tradition, then the staff watched you with something far quieter, but just as powerful. They were the silent observers, the unseen archivists of royal life, the people who moved through the palace like shadow and structure. They were everywhere, yet never fully present, close enough to notice anything unusual, distant enough to pretend they had not. And in their silence lived a strange kind of truth, one that shaped the life of any royal who carried secrets. The palace routine ran on their movements. Before dawn, they were already awake, gliding across polished floors, opening curtains, lighting lamps, arranging breakfasts, heating water for baths. They entered your world before you even rose from the bed. And yet, despite being the first to see you each morning, they never acknowledged what they noticed. It was not their place to mention your tired eyes, or the subtle tension in your posture, or the way you hesitated before speaking. But they noticed. They always noticed. The staff of an early 1900s palace operated like an invisible network. They passed each other in hallways with quiet nods, communicating through glances and small gestures. A raised eyebrow might mean a guest had arrived. Unexpectedly, a slight tilt of the head might indicate someone needed assistance. A single, barely audible shift of breath could warn of tension in a room. They understood one another with an ease born from years of shared service. And because of that, they understood you. Not fully, not in the way family believed they did, but in small, intimate ways that came from observing someone day after day, year after year. They noticed the things you tried hardest to hide, not because they were looking for them, but because your life unfolded in front of them like an unspoken diary. A valet knew when you favored a certain jacket without saying why. A maid recognized when you paused a moment too long while selecting a tie. A butler noticed the subtle shift in your expression When a particular name appeared in a letter, they knew your habits, your patterns, your rhythms. They noticed when something broke the pattern. And yet, they never said a word. Silence was not just a skill. It was their oath. Still, that silence held weight. Because being watched by people who pretended not to see was sometimes more unsettling than being watched by people who openly scrutinized you. With family, you could anticipate questions. With the public, you could prepare rehearsed smiles. But with staff, those who floated at the edges of your life, appearing and disappearing at precise moments, you never quite knew what they understood, what they suspected, what they pieced together. You might sit in your study, reading a letter that sent your heart into a quiet flutter, and hear the soft footsteps of a maid outside the door. You would fold the letter quickly, place it beneath a book, compose your face, and call softly for tea. When she entered, she would see nothing but your calm expression and your neatly arranged desk. But she would also see the faint warmth lingering on your cheeks, the slight tremble in your hand as you handed her the empty cup, the way your eyes darted toward the hidden letter for a fraction of a second. She would not comment. She would not linger. She would simply nod and leave. But she would remember. And so you learned an art of your own, how to live within sight of people who were trained to see everything, while revealing nothing. You mastered the subtle placement of letters, the quick, practiced motions of sliding notes into pockets, the careful timing of leaving your room only when you knew staff were between duties. You learned to smile with just enough sincerity to ease suspicion without inviting curiosity. Still, the staff's awareness was not malicious. They were not seeking to expose you. They were not rooting through your life in search of scandal. They had their own hierarchy, their own code of honor, their own invisible boundaries. For many of them, protecting a member of the royal household, especially one they had served since childhood, was part of their unspoken loyalty. You might catch it in the smallest gestures. A footman who entered a room a moment later than he could have, giving you time to gather yourself. A maid who knocked twice instead of once, warning you that someone was coming. A cook who placed your favorite dessert on a tray when you had had an especially tense day. A gardener who pretended not to see you walking with someone who was not supposed to matter. These acts were gentle, quiet, almost invisible, but they were real. Still, the awareness of their presence never left you. The palace breathed with them. Their footsteps echoed softly in the mornings. Their whispers drifted through the hallways like dust in sunlight. Their movements created the rhythm of your days. And because they noticed everything, you had to maintain your performance even in the least expected moments. In the library, where the shelves created shadowed corners. In the music room, where sunlight made everything look softer. In the drawing room, where a single misplaced glance could become a story if seen by the wrong pair of eyes. Your emotions became something to be stored, like fine porcelain, delicate, fragile, and easily broken if left unattended. You learned to smile even when you felt the heaviness of loneliness settling across your shoulders. You learned to appear steady even when your heart raced with the weight of unspoken truths. You learned to walk slowly Speak gently. Breathe evenly, because any deviation could draw attention. Yet, in their quiet way, the staff became the keepers of your humanity. They saw you not as a symbol or a lineage, but as a person, someone who sighed softly when tired, who lingered near windows when deep in thought, who touched fabrics in the dressing room with a tenderness that spoke more than words. They saw your vulnerability without naming it. They witnessed your longing without intruding on it. They carried your unspoken fears alongside the trays and linens and letters they handled every day. You depended on their silence. They offered it freely, and in that complicated exchange, something like trust grew. Not the trust of equals, not the trust of family, but the trust that comes from living your life in front of people who protect your most fragile truths simply by pretending not to notice them. Because in a palace filled with polished surfaces, watchful relatives, and strict expectations, it was the staff, the silent observers, who made it possible to breathe, even if only lightly. They were the quietest presence in your world, yet the ones who understood more than anyone realized. And through their quiet loyalty, they helped you survive a life that demanded secrecy at every turn. If mornings required discipline and afternoons demanded composure, then social gatherings, those polished, glittering moments meant to display the unity and charm of the royal household, were the true tests of endurance. They were the places where your smile had to be brightest, your voice most steady, your gestures most graceful. And yet, beneath all that elegance, they were also the most dangerous spaces for someone living with a secret heart. The gatherings varied: breakfasts with visiting relatives, afternoon teas with aristocrats, charity events filled with polite chatter, rehearsed laughs, and the delicate balancing act of small talk. Then there were the larger affairs, dinners in long halls where candles shimmered against silverware, garden parties where the paths were lined with blooming roses, evening balls where music drifted like perfume through the air. Each setting carried its own challenges, its own opportunities for missteps. In these spaces, eyes multiplied, curiosity sharpened, conversations overlap, creating a soft murmur that seemed harmless on the surface, but could carry your name across a room before you even realized you would become a topic. Social gatherings were where people watched you the most, not because they were suspicious, but because they were interested. You were royalty. You were expected to be observed, and with that expectation came risk. A smile held too long could be interpreted as affection. A glance that lingered could be misread as intention. A moment of hesitation could become the basis of a rumor. You learned to navigate these rooms as if you were crossing thin ice. Step gently. Move smoothly. Respond gracefully. Never reveal too much. Never let your true thoughts slip into your expression. At dinners, the conversations followed familiar rhythms. Someone to your left might mention an upcoming political event. Someone across from you might discuss travel plans. Someone on your right might lightly tease you about your responsibilities or make hopeful comments about your future marriage. The laughter around the table would rise and fall like a tide, while your responses flowed with practiced ease. But beneath the surface, your attention remained finely tuned. You could feel the weight of every gaze, the subtle shifts of interest, the way people leaned just a little closer when they sensed something meaningful in your tone. You could sense when someone's curiosity sharpened, when an innocent topic drifted dangerously close to your private world. Even the simplest interactions required an almost impossible balance. If you appeared too reserved, relatives whispered concerns. If you appeared too warm toward someone, they whispered even more. If you avoided someone completely, your silence became an invitation for speculation. So you existed in the middle space, warm but not too warm, engaged but not too enthusiastic, attentive but never intimate, a perfect equilibrium that felt almost impossible to maintain. Yet you performed it day after day, event after event, surrounded by chandeliers, polished floors, and the soft echo of footsteps. Garden parties brought their own challenges. The open space made it easier to move away when conversations became too pointed. But the bright sunlight and the wandering nature of the gathering meant people noticed where you walked, who you stood beside, and who made you laugh. Even the simple act of pausing beside a particular guest could turn into a whispered observation. Did you see how they lingered? I wonder what they were discussing. I have never seen them smile quite like that. And so you learn to walk with intention, but never too much intention. You mastered the art of gentle distance, never drifting too close, never staying too long. You carried yourself with grace, with charm, with the ease of someone who felt entirely comfortable in the public eye, even when the truth was that every breath felt like a calculation. Balls and evening events were the most treacherous. The music, the dim lighting, the glimmer of jewelry, the invitation to move more freely, it all created an atmosphere that felt deceptively safe. You danced with people chosen for you, smiled at admirers without letting any expression deepen, accepted compliments graciously, and held conversations that never revealed more than the surface of your thoughts. But dancing was dangerous in its own way. The closeness, the hands touching, the guided steps, everything blurred the lines between pretense and feeling. A simple dance with the wrong person, or a simple refusal to dance with the expected person, could spark a week's worth of speculation. And yet, within all that risk, there were tiny flashes of freedom, moments when your eyes accidentally met someone else across the room, and, for a single breath, your guard slipped. For a single breath, you felt seen not as the polished figure performing a role, but as yourself. But even that single breath had to be smothered quickly, because if anyone else noticed, the story they created would not be the truth you carried, but the truth they feared. Teas in the drawing room with aristocratic families were quieter, but no less dangerous. People sat in comfortable chairs, sipping from porcelain cups, speaking in low voices. Conversations wandered more freely in these settings, which meant questions could come unexpectedly, softly, sweetly, devastatingly. Have you given any thought to future plans? You must be considering certain prospects by now. Surely, you have been spending a lot of time with so and so lately. Have not you? Their tone was always pleasant, but their curiosity was unwavering, and you, caught between honesty and necessity, offered replies that sounded thoughtful while revealing nothing at all. You learned to use vagueness as a shield. You learned to smile in ways that suggested agreement without committing to anything meaningful. You learned to laugh softly at questions that, in any other life, might have felt harmless. The gatherings were stage plays, and you played your part beautifully. But the truth was that every hour spent in those rooms chipped away at the energy you kept hidden beneath the surface. Because maintaining the illusion required constant awareness, constant shaping of expression, tone, posture, and mood. Even your laughter had to be monitored. Too much joy could draw attention. Too little could raise concern. You walked a narrow path between being noticeable and being invisible, trying to balance on a line that shifted with every person you encountered. Yet, perhaps the most exhausting part was not the performance itself, but the fear beneath it. The fear that one misstep, one unguarded look, one forgotten mask, one moment of softness would lead someone to ask the question you could never answer truthfully. Because in these glittering rooms filled with light and laughter, the greatest danger was not that someone would see you. It was that someone would see through you. And so, with the same steady grace you had mastered since childhood, you moved through each event as though floating untouchable, composed, admired, a perfect figure in a perfect role, a quiet master of emotional concealment, a person hidden in plain sight. If social gatherings were the most dangerous arenas, then romance, real, fragile, trembling romance, was the most dangerous force of all. Not because love itself was unwelcome, but because the wrong kind of love, in the wrong time, in the wrong family, could unravel everything. And yet, even in a world built on rules and duty, the heart found ways to make itself known. Not loudly, not boldly, but quietly, like a candle hidden inside a lantern, glowing through the cracks. For a royal who lived with a truth they could never speak, affection had no place in grand gestures. It lived in the spaces between things, in pauses that lasted half a second too long, in glances exchanged in passing, in the soft tilt of a smile shared only when no one else was watching. Romance existed in the quietest moments, because those were the only moments safe enough to hold it. Imagine a hallway, long and silent, lined with portraits and lit by afternoon sun. You walk through it with steady steps, your posture perfect, your expression calm. And just as you turn a corner, someone appears, someone who makes your breath catch, not because of their rank or importance, but because of the way your thoughts soften when you see them. For a fraction of a second, the world narrows. Sound fades. Time stretches. And in that fraction, your eyes meet theirs. It is only a glance, too quick for anyone else to notice. But between the two of you, it holds the weight of entire conversations. The glance says, "I see you." It says, "I remember last night." It says, "I wish we were alone." It says all the things neither of you can speak. And then, just as quickly, you look away. The performance resumes. The moment tucks itself into your chest like a secret letter, Sometimes the affection you shared lived in more tangible gestures. A handkerchief folded and placed deliberately near your seat. A pressed flower hidden between the pages of a book you were known to read. A note written in simple, harmless words, but with handwriting that curled in ways only the two of you understood. Even the ink seemed to carry emotion. These gestures were small enough to be dismissed as politeness, yet meaningful enough to make your pulse quicken. They were messages wrapped inside everyday actions. They were invitations soft, cautious, tender. The palace gardens held many of these moments. With their tall hedges, winding paths, and sunlit corners, they offered rare pockets of privacy. When the two of you found yourselves walking side by side during a garden party, the conversation was never too direct. Always safe. Always proper. But beneath the words was something stronger, a parallel. Conversation carried by the way your fingers brushed the leaves as you walked, or the way their voice softened when they said your name. You talked about roses, or music, or the weather, but the real message lived under the surface. Every shared step was a confession. Every quiet moment was a promise. And yet, even in those precious minutes, you remained alert. A distant footstep could pull you both apart. A sudden call from a relative could end the moment before it had fully formed. You learned to savor incompleteness, to hold on to something that never had the chance to become whole. Evening gatherings were worse. Soft lighting, slow music, the warmth of a crowded room. It was all too easy to let your guard slip. Dancing was out of the question, unless it was part of the formal expectation. And even then, it had to be with someone your family approved of, someone whose presence around you felt like a costume you had to wear. But sometimes, across the dance floor, you would see them, standing in the glow of the chandeliers, watching with an expression too subtle for anyone else to interpret. And for a moment, your heart would lift, remembering a world that existed only between the two of you. The most meaningful interactions often happened at night, not in meetings, not during events, but in the quiet moments when the palace settled into stillness. Footsteps faded. Conversations dwindled. Lamps dimmed. And somewhere in the maze of rooms and corridors, you would cross paths with them intentionally or by chance. You never fully knew. A brief conversation in a shadowed hallway, a whispered good night, a smile exchanged by candlelight. Nothing inappropriate. Nothing dangerous. Nothing that could be held against either of you. Just the soft recognition of connection, the gentle warmth of knowing that someone else understood this strange, lonely world you lived in. But even these small fragments of romance required planning, timing, awareness. A single servant appearing at the wrong moment could shatter everything. A family member walking by unexpectedly could turn a harmless conversation into something suspicious. And so you both became masters of subtlety. A tilt of the head meaning, "Not here." A soft inhale meaning, "Later." A smile held only at the corner of the mouth meaning, I wish it were different. Romance became a language without words, a language spoken in gestures, glances, and the quiet courage of showing emotion in a world that feared emotion. The most bittersweet moments came when you stood near them in public, close enough to hear their voice, but not close enough to let your hands touch. You listened to them speak to others and kept your expression neutral. You watched them laugh and kept your posture steady. You felt the distance like a physical ache, but also like a strange kind of devotion, because maintaining that distance was a way of protecting them. And sometimes on rare, sacred nights you let yourself imagine a world where things could be different. A world where the two of you could walk through the palace openly. A world where you did not have to hide your smile, your warmth, your longing. A world where love was not something to be tucked away beneath layers of etiquette, but something that could be held gently in both hands. But morning always returned, duty always returned, reality always returned, and so romance remained what it had always been, something hidden in plain sight. Something so delicate that even speaking of it out loud caused it to disappear. Yet it survived, not in grand declarations, not in dramatic moments, but in the quiet strength of two people who found a way to love each other in a world that gave them almost no room to do so. Their love lived in silence, but silence did not make it small. It made it sacred. If romance was a quiet rebellion, then communication, the kind that kept feelings alive, was a delicate battlefield. In a world where you could not speak openly, where even a harmless smile could raise eyebrows, every message had to be disguised. Words became dangerous, glances became maps, and even the placement of a handkerchief could carry the weight of a confession. Communication was not simply something you did. It was something you survived. The entire palace became a living codebook. Hallways, staircases, parlors, and gardens all held invisible meanings, known only to those who needed to know them. A person in your position learned this code instinctively, the way some people learn music or language. It became part of your breath, your posture, your heartbeat. A glance could say what a full sentence never dared to whisper. A gesture could carry emotion without ever touching the air. It began with the simplest tools, handkerchiefs. They were accessories to everyone else, but messages to you. A handkerchief folded into a square and placed on the piano meant later tonight. One tucked halfway into your sleeve meant not safe here. If you saw theirs arranged just slightly crooked in their pocket, you knew immediately, I am thinking of you. And if it was missing entirely, not a trace of linen in sight, that was the warning that made your pulse quicken. Someone is watching. Be careful. Then there were the eyebrows. You never realized how expressive a single eyebrow could be until the two of you had perfected an entire secret language with them. A slight lift meant curiosity. A sharper arch meant caution. A soft knit between the brows, just a flicker, meant do not speak. A subtle raise and drop meant it is safe to look my way. You practiced these gestures in mirrors, the same mirrors where you once rehearsed polite smiles and diplomatic nods. Now those mirrors became your training grounds for surviving forbidden conversations. You grew skilled at reading lips without appearing to stare. at catching the micro-pause in their breath when someone else's question came too close to the truth, at listening to the small shifts in tone, those tiny fractures that would go unnoticed by anyone except someone who lived in the shadows of meaning. Safe phrases became coded invitations. Will you attend the musical tonight? Meant I want to see you. I enjoyed the gardens this afternoon. Meant I noticed you were not there. I believe rain is coming. Meant something feels wrong. Be cautious. And then there was writing. Writing was both the greatest danger and the closest thing to freedom. Every letter had to be crafted with absolute precision. The ink spoke, the spacing spoke. The lack of a signature spoke louder than anything. You learned to write with layers, polite sentences on the surface, and hidden meanings buried in punctuation. A sentence with an M- meant longing. A sentence ending too neatly meant fear. A line of poetry quoted without context meant I miss you. A slip of blank paper tucked inside an envelope meant meet me if you dare. But the greatest art was knowing what not to write. Ink was permanent. Ink could be found. Ink could betray you. So you filled entire pages with harmless pleasantries and let meaning live in the spaces between your words. Sometimes the emptiness was the message. Sometimes the silence was the confession. Of course, miscommunication was inevitable. A misplaced comma could accidentally imply heartbreak. A slight smudge of ink could make a friendly message look like an accusation. Once, your sneeze in the wrong moment caused them to misread an eyebrow signal entirely, and the two of you spent an entire dinner avoiding each other simply because a stray speck of dust had altered the code. You learned to laugh silently at these mistakes later, replaying them like harmless storms you had survived. At gatherings, your conversations layered one atop of the one spoken aloud for the room, one whispered through fleeting expressions, and one carried entirely through careful choreography. When someone asked, "Would you like more tea?" you answered the question with your voice, but replied to them with your eyes. When your family mentioned eligible women, you responded politely while shifting your hand a mere inch, letting them know that yes, you were fine, you were holding steady, you had everything under control. Some signals were bolder, riskier, a brush of the sleeve as you passed, a quiet step closer than necessary, a deliberate pause in your sentence when speaking to someone else, just to see if they would catch the tremble in your voice. These were not accidents. These were the moments you saved for days when the weight of silence felt unbearable, and you needed to feel seen, even if only for a second. But the greatest moments of communication happened when no words or gestures were exchanged at all. When the two of you simply existed in the same space and let the air between you carry meaning. Sitting across from each other at a dinner table, knowing without looking that they were thinking the same thing you were. Standing beside them during a choir hymn, your shoulders almost touching, passing each other in a corridor so quietly that your footsteps felt like messages. These moments were breathless not because they were dramatic, but because they were allowed to exist at all. And yet, every code, every signal, carried risk. Servants noticed things. Aunts noticed everything. Even the family scourge loyal and perceptive, had an uncanny talent for appearing whenever your interactions lingered a moment too long. You learned to adapt, to shift your codes, to create new ones as old ones became too recognizable. Still, communication persisted. It survived scrutiny. It survived danger. It survived the endless demands of royal appearances. You both learned to weave meaning into moments others would think insignificant. The tilt of a teacup, the rhythm of your steps, the way you held a book with the title facing outward on days when you needed reassurance, a small signal that meant I am all right, and on days when fear tightened around your chest, when whispers in the halls made you question every glance you would ever exchanged. A single look from them could unravel that fear entirely. A look that said, you are not alone. Not today. The palace demanded silence. Society demanded distance. Tradition demanded obedience. But your shared language, your coded words, your secret signals became something stronger than all of that. It became proof that even in the strictest, coldest rooms of royal life, warmth could bloom quietly. It became a lifeline, a rebellion, a whisper of hope. It was not loud. It was not bold. It was not free. But it was real. And sometimes, real was enough to keep the heart alive. If secret codes kept your heart alive, then rumors were the shadows always waiting at the edge of that fragile light. In the royal world of the early 1900s, rumor was not an inconvenience, it was a force. A breath, a ripple, a single careless whisper could travel faster than any carriage, slither through corridors, seep under doorways, and settle into the ears of those who had the power to change your life forever. And when you carried a truth that could not survive daylight, rumor became the quiet threat that followed you everywhere. Rumors did not announce themselves. They emerged from the softest places, an overheard conversation between maids polishing silverware, a butler exchanging casual remarks with a footman, a relative lingering too long in a doorway. The palace itself seemed designed to encourage them. Its high ceilings echoed sound in unpredictable ways. Its hallways twisted and narrowed, creating pockets where voices carried. Even the gardens, with their hedges and stone pathways, had corners where a passing remark could be frozen in the air, waiting for the wrong person to hear it. You became adept at sensing the first shift, the subtle change in atmosphere that meant something had begun. Perhaps a servant paused a second longer before opening a door. Perhaps an aunt looked at you with a softness tinged with uncertainty rather than affection. Perhaps, during a family tea, the conversation suddenly felt too carefully curated, as if people were choosing their words with more caution than usual. Rumors did not need proof. They needed only curiosity. And curiosity was the one resource in the palace that never ran out. The risk lay not only in what you did, but in what others thought you did. You might leave a room at the same moment as the person you cared for, and an observant maid might raise an eyebrow. You might speak too gently while handing them a book, and someone watching might interpret that softness as something bigger. You might avoid someone entirely, and a cousin would wonder why the distance felt deliberate. Suspicion did not require evidence, only a pattern someone believed they saw. One of the cruelest truths was that even innocence could look like guilt if viewed from the wrong angle. You learned that every choice carried two meanings, the one you intended and the one that might be constructed around it. A misplaced letter could become a clue. A smile held for a second too long could become a story. A sigh overheard through a half-open door could become a scandal. And because of this, you lived with a quiet, constant awareness, a soft pressure at the base of your lungs, the sensation of always standing near the edge of something fragile. You monitored your own footsteps. You rehearsed your pauses. You measured your laughter with precision. You became fluent in the art of giving nothing away. But even perfection was not enough, because you could not control everything. Sometimes rumors began not from your actions but from someone else's imagination. Bored aristocrats invented narratives to entertain themselves. Relatives speculated out of misguided affection, claiming they were concerned. Servants made quiet assumptions based on glimpses, not truths. And worst of all, sometimes people simply needed a story to explain what they did not understand. You could feel rumors moving long before you heard them spoken. They moved like temperature, a subtle change in the air around you. People smiled the same, but their eyes lingered too long. Conversations stayed polite, but their tone shifted. A sense of watching settled into the edges of your days, invisible but undeniable. There were moments terrifying, breath-stealing moments when you walked into a room and felt as though the walls had leaned in an inch. Listening, when the quiet between sentences felt charged with unspoken questions. When a relative asked if you were feeling yourself lately, and you had to rely on instinct to determine whether the question came from concern or suspicion. Your mind became your constant companion, analyzing situations before you even stepped into them, choosing where to stand, predicting who would be present, weighing which topics were safe, which were dangerous, which required a small lie wrapped in a polite smile. But rumors were not only threats. They were mirrors, distorted ones. Yes, but mirrors nonetheless. They reflected the fears of society, the expectations of the family, the limitations placed upon you. They reminded you daily that your life belonged to the lineage more than to yourself, that even the faintest hint of deviation could unravel generations of carefully constructed image. And yet, beneath that fear lived something softer, the knowledge that despite the risk, despite the danger, despite the ever-present threat of someone discovering what your heart tried so hard to hide, you still felt. You still cared. You still chose to love in the quiet corners of your life. That defiance gave you strength, even when the world demanded perfection. But strength could only protect you so far. The wrong rumor, spoken to the wrong person, could rewrite your entire future. You had seen it happen before, to cousins whose careless choices were magnified into scandal, to distant relatives who found themselves quietly relocated to summer estates, to acquaintances who were simply never mentioned again. This fear shaped your movements more than any royal protocol ever could. It determined whom you could stand beside, how long you could look at someone, and what topics you avoided. It determined the length of your smiles, the softness of your voice, the tilt of your head during conversations. It became woven into your body, until even your posture carried caution. And yet, the person you cared for understood this without needing explanation. You could see it in the way they never stood too close, never laughed too readily, never risked lingering in a hallway where footsteps echoed too clearly. They adjusted their behavior to protect you, even when it meant suppressing their own instincts. It was both heartbreaking and beautiful the way love twisted itself into shapes small enough to fit inside a world that had no space for it. And always, behind everything, the rumor lingered, a shadow waiting to lengthen, a spark waiting for the smallest breath to ignite. You learned to live with it not as an enemy you could defeat, but as a storm you could only navigate. You became the eye of your own hurricane, calm, composed, smiling politely even as chaos swirled just beyond reach. Because the truth was simple. In the royal world, scandal could end a life, but silence carefully chosen, fiercely protected, could save one. And so you moved through each day with quiet courage, carrying your secret heart not like a burden, but like a flame cupped in your hands, guarded against every whisper of wind. If rumor was the shadow always following your steps, then escape those rare, precious pockets of freedom became the breath that kept you from suffocating. A royal life in the early 1900s allowed very little space for rebellion. Yet it offered just enough cracks in its structure to let a whisper of freedom slip through. These escapes were not grand disappearances or daring adventures. They were subtle, carefully planned, threaded into the routines of privilege. But to someone who lived so much of their life behind a mask, these small escapes felt like entire worlds. The first escape was always the clubs. Elegant, wood-paneled rooms with velvet chairs, soft lamplight, and the low murmur of conversation. In public, these clubs were symbols of masculine camaraderie, places where aristocrats discussed politics, economics, and the inevitable weight of duty. But behind closed doors, where the air smelled faintly of cigar smoke and polished leather, the rules softened. People became looser around the edges. Conversations drifted into personal territory. And for someone like you, these rooms offered a kind of anonymity you could not find anywhere else. You could sit in a corner with a glass in hand, observing the room through half-lidded eyes, letting the background noise swallow you like a fog. No one watched too closely. No one expected perfect posture or unshakable grace. Here, you were just another man in a tailored suit, another figure leaning back in a leather chair. The staff was discreet. The members minded their own secrets. And though you never crossed any dangerous lines, simply existing in a room where scrutiny dimmed felt like lifting a stone from your chest. Then there was the opera. It became another kind of refuge, one filled with velvet curtains, soaring music, and the dark warmth of the theater. You would sit in your private box, the one lined with red fabric and carved wood, while the orchestra tuned their instruments below. And for the first time all week, maybe all month, you could let your face soften without fear. The shadows of the box were kind to you. They allowed you to feel, to breathe, to mourn, to dream. Music did what words could not. It untangled emotions you had pressed flat beneath layers of etiquette. It allowed longing to rise quietly in your chest. Like a tide against the shore, it let you imagine a life not shaped by rules or expectations. And sometimes, only sometimes, the person who understood your heart would sit somewhere in the audience or in another box, also hidden by shadows. You never spoke. You never looked too long. But knowing they were in the same room, listening to the same music, sharing the same moment, created a thread of connection more intimate than any spoken confession. The opera became your shared sanctuary, a place where emotion was allowed to exist without explanation. Travel offered a different kind of freedom. There were official trips, of course tours, diplomatic visits, appearances meant to strengthen alliances. But between these carefully structured moments, you found flickers of privacy. A quiet morning on a balcony overlooking a foreign harbor. A carriage ride through an unfamiliar landscape where no one recognized you. A night in a hotel where the walls were not lined with portraits of ancestors who demanded perfection. Away from the palace, you felt lighter. Your footsteps sounded different on unfamiliar stone streets. Your reflection in a foreign mirror looked slightly less rehearsed. You could linger by a window without someone interpreting the reason. And though you still carried your role with you, still dressed the part, still spoke with measured grace, the distance created a gentle looseness, a softening of edges. Sometimes the person you cared for traveled as part of the entourage, and in those cases, the world shifted in subtle, dangerous, beautiful ways. A shared glance through a carriage window, a brief exchange of words while walking through a marketplace, a moment where your hands brushed accidentally, and neither of you pulled away quite as quickly as usual. Every interaction felt like a stolen jewel, precious because it barely existed at all. But the greatest escape, the one society encouraged, even celebrated, was military service. To the public, it symbolized duty, honor, and patriotic strength. To the palace, it was a rite of passage. To you, it was unexpectedly liberating. The structure of military life, strict as it was, offered something your royal life never did. Simplicity. There were no endless meetings, no layers of social performance, no suffocating silk dinners. You wore a uniform that erased rank differences among officers. You lived among men who judged you by your actions, not by your lineage. You woke early, trained hard, followed orders, and for once, every movement was dictated not by appearances but by necessity. Your muscles ached, your clothes carried dirt, your hair was not always perfectly styled. And strangely, this felt like a relief, being allowed to exist without polish, without constant interpretation. Out in the field or on the deck of a ship, the horizon stretched wide, uncluttered by obligation. At night, when the air was cold and the world was quiet, you could sit with your thoughts without fearing they would betray you. And sometimes, when you allowed yourself a rare moment of vulnerability, you wondered what life would look like if it were always this simple. Military service also created spaces where coded glances and small interactions felt safer. The public did not scrutinize every expression on a training ground. Even the other officers, preoccupied with their own tasks, noticed far less than palace residents. And so, if the person you cared for happened to be within reach, whether as a fellow officer, an aide, or a visiting companion, you could share moments of near normalcy. A shared drink after a long day, a quiet conversation on the deck under the stars, a few minutes walking side by side without fear of a relative emerging from behind a column. These moments were small, but they stitched together a sense of humanity you rarely felt inside the palace walls. And yet, every escape, no matter how comforting, was temporary. Clubs closed. Opera curtains fell. Ships returned to harbour. Foreign tours ended. The palace always waited at the end of your path, its tall windows glowing like watchful eyes in the night. But each escape, no matter how brief, reminded you that beyond the rigid performance of royal life, there existed a softer version of yourself, one who still felt deeply, still hoped quietly, still longed stubbornly. These escapes were not rebellions. They were survival, a way to keep your heart from turning to stone under the weight of expectation. Because even in a world built to confine you, some part of you still reached for freedom in the smallest of places. For all the elegance, all the duty, all the polished surfaces of royal life, the heaviest weight you carried was the one no one saw. It was not the crown, nor the expectation, nor the scrutiny. It was the quiet, persistent ache of loneliness and ache that settled in your chest like a second heartbeat. Hidden, rhythmic, constant. Everyone saw the posture, the smile, the dignity. No one saw the exhaustion behind your eyes when the day ended, or the way you sometimes sat alone in a quiet room, feeling the silence press against your ribs. Loneliness in a palace felt different from loneliness anywhere else. It echoed. It stretched. It wore velvet gloves. It slipped into moments that were meant to feel comforting. Even surrounded by people, servants moving gracefully, relatives conversing in warm tones, advisors presenting plans with impeccable courtesy, you felt an emptiness that no amount of company could fill. The palace was never quiet, yet somehow it amplified silence. Part of that loneliness came from the simple fact that you lived two lives at once. The external one, everyone praised, the perfect, royal, composed and dutiful, and the internal one, tender and fragile, filled with emotions you could reveal only in the quietest corners of your mind. Carrying those two selves inside one body required immense strength, and strength came at a cost. It wore you down in ways no one else ever noticed. There were nights when you stared at your own reflection and did not recognize the person looking back. Not because you looked different, but because the version of yourself that mattered most was always hidden behind layers of expectation. You became skilled at wearing expressions like garments: kindness, calm, restraint, interest, slipping them on and off depending on who stood before you. The only expression that truly belonged to you was the one you were in solitude. To survive this internal divide, you developed coping mechanisms, quiet rituals that anchored you, pulling you back to yourself. The first ritual was writing. You kept a private notebook tucked into a drawer beneath layers of folded linen, hidden where no maid would ever think to look. Its cover was simple, unmarked. intentionally, unremarkable. Inside, however, lived the only place where your voice could speak freely. You did not write names. You did not write confessions. You wrote fragments, thoughts, feelings, memories, questions. Little pieces of yourself scattered like stars across the pages. Sometimes you wrote only a sentence. Sometimes you wrote for an hour, ink pooling where emotion grew too heavy to shape into words. Sometimes you simply held the notebook, feeling its weight, as though it could absorb the ache for you. Another ritual lived in the gardens. On mornings when expectations tightened like a too small collar, you slipped outside under the pretext of fresh air. The staff never questioned it. Royals needed freshness the way others needed food. So you walked among the hedges and roses, letting the cold air soothe your thoughts. You touched the petals lightly, grounding yourself in the softness. You listened to the wind brushing through the leaves and remembered that beyond all the rules and duties, there was still a world where things grew freely. Without permission, the gardens became a place for breathing, a place where no one watched too closely, a place where you could let your posture soften by a fraction, only a fraction. But even that small release felt like a full exhale. On more difficult days, your coping came in the form of routines. There was comfort in order, folding cuffs just so, tightening laces just right, straightening your desk with small, precise gestures. These motions felt like anchors, reminding you that some parts of your life were still within your control. In a world where everything was scrutinized, these repetitive tasks allowed your mind a moment of rest. But the loneliness deepened during evenings, when noise faded and duties ended. That was when thoughts had space to roam, when the ache beneath your ribs grew heavier, when the walls felt too familiar, too close, too full of memories you wished you could forget. It was during these hours that the longing for true connection, freely given, freely held, felt sharpest. You often found yourself drawn to the window, watching the night settle over the palace grounds. From a distance, everything looked peaceful. The lamplights glowed softly, the trees swayed, the moon drifted above it all, indifferent to the rules of the human world. Sometimes you pressed your fingers lightly against the cold glass, imagining for a moment what it would feel like to walk beyond the gates without obligation, pulling at your heels. And then there were the rare night whites, and the person who understood your hidden heart crossed paths with you. A simple exchange, 2 sentences, a brief glance felt like a bomb. You could sense their understanding without needing explanation. They did not ask you to smile. They did not ask you to be strong. They simply existed near you, and that presence eased the ache in ways words never could. This kind of companionship, quiet and unspoken, became its own form of survival. Not romance, not rebellion, just connection. A reminder that you were not entirely alone, even if the world insisted you must be. But even with these coping mechanisms, the strain sometimes slipped through the cracks. There were days when weariness settled deep in your bones, when even the most practiced smile felt heavy. Days when the pressure of knowing you could derail your entire future with a single misstep left your hands trembling slightly beneath your sleeves. Days when you longed desperately, achingly, for just 1 hour, where you did not have to edit your every movement. Yet you endured, not because endurance was noble, but because it was necessary. You learned to transform loneliness into a kind of resilience. You learned to hold sorrow without letting it drown you. You learned to take the fragile parts of yourself and wrap them in gentleness. Even when the world was not gentle with you, there were moments quiet, fleeting, when you wondered what your life might have looked like if you had been born into a different world, a different era, a different family, a life where your secret did not have to be secret, a life where you could share your heart without fear, a life where you could sit beside someone you loved and let the world see it without consequence. But morning always came, and with morning came the performance, and with the performance came the mask you had perfected so well it felt like a second skin. Still, beneath that mask, your inner life remained vivid, tender, alive, and maybe, just maybe, that quiet inner resilience was its own form of courage. Growing older in the palace was like watching the same world through a softer lens. The halls stayed polished, the portraits stayed stern, the routines stayed rigid, but something in you changed. The spark of youth, once sharp and restless, mellowed into a quiet awareness. You moved more slowly, not because of frailty, but because you finally understood the weight of every step you had taken through those corridors. And with age came a strange kind of permission, not from the world, but from yourself. In youth, everything felt loud inside your chest. The fear, the longing, the excitement, the secrecy. Every glance carried danger, every moment risked exposure. But in old age, those difficulties became memories instead of burdens. You found yourself able to look back with a gentleness you never imagined during the crisis of living it. The edges of fear softened, the sharpness of loss dulled into something bittersweet. Even the secrecy, once suffocating, became a thread woven into the tapestry of your life rather than a chain around your neck. You began to understand that survival had been its own form of rebellion. Quiet rebellion, yes, but rebellion nonetheless. There were mornings when you sat by the window with a shawl draped over your shoulders, watching the gardens change with the seasons. You had lived through so many, seen the roses bloom and wither dozens of times, watched the first frost kiss the hedges with silver. In these quiet hours, with sunlight warming the back of your hands, you let your thoughts wander to places you would never let them wander before. You remembered moments so delicate they felt like they could crack if you held them too tightly. A shared glance at a dinner table, a secret note folded into your pocket, a night at the opera when a single look across the darkened hall made your heart stumble. These memories no longer brought fear. They brought warmth. They were pieces of a life you once had to hide, now allowed to glow freely in the privacy of your aging mind. And perhaps the strangest realization of all was that, despite everything, despite the years of restraint, the rehearsed composure, the coded gestures, you had lived a life fuller than anyone suspected. Your secret heart had shaped you more deeply than your title ever could. With age, you found freedom not in rebellion against the world, but in letting your memories breathe. You no longer needed to protect them, no longer feared someone piecing together the truth. Those who once held power over your future were gone or frail. The social rules that once felt impermeable had softened with time. Society itself had shifted, its sharp judgments dulling into broader compassion. You sometimes wondered what your younger self would think if they could see you now sitting comfortably in an overstuffed armchair, sipping tea, no longer flinching at every unexpected footstep outside your door. Would they envy your peace? Would they resent how long it took to arrive? Or would they feel relief that, somehow, despite the fear and the secrecy, the story had not ended in tragedy? The palace felt different now. The rooms that once demanded perfection now allowed imperfection. Servants who once stood stiff and alert now moved slowly, respectfully, giving you space. New faces filled roles you once knew well. Younger royals walked the halls with the same mix of uncertainty and confidence you once carried. You recognized their guarded expressions, their calculated smiles, their practiced neutrality. You saw yourself in them, not the title or the posture, but the quiet tension behind their eyes. And sometimes, on days when your heart felt particularly open, you found yourself offering them small, gentle guidance. A hand placed reassuringly on a shoulder, a sentence softened with intention, a knowing look, never revealing too much, never daring to, but giving just enough for them to understand they were not alone in whatever story they carried inside themselves. You became, unknowingly, the kind of presence you once longed for. There were still nights when loneliness visited, but it was not the sharp loneliness of youth. It was softer, like a familiar guest who no longer frightened you. You had lived long enough to understand that loneliness was not a flaw. It was simply a companion of introspection, a side effect of having loved quietly, deeply, in ways the world never saw. And sometimes, at dusk, when the sky turned lavender and the lamps flickered on, you felt the presence of old memories like gentle silhouettes walking beside you. The person who once understood your secret heart, whether they remained in your life or became a cherished memory, appeared in your thoughts, not with regret, but with gratitude. They had given you something no title, no honor, no accolade ever could. The experience of being known, even if only in stolen fragments. As years layered upon years, your priorities shifted. You began to value softness over strength, truth over performance, stillness over ceremony. You no longer feared the possibility of being discovered. What was there left for discovery to ruin? You had lived your story, survived its storms, cherished its quiet joys. No rumor could change that now, and in this late chapter of life, you found the courage to be subtly defiant. Not publicly, the world did not need spectacle from you, but privately, in ways that mattered more. You allowed yourself to keep letters you once would have burned. You placed a pressed flower in a drawer instead of hiding it away. You let your diary remain slightly ajar on the desk, as if welcoming anyone curious enough to understand. You spoke more openly about the importance of authenticity, even if your words were wrapped in metaphor. Your rebellion was not loud. It did not seek to dismantle tradition. It simply insisted on gentleness toward yourself, toward those struggling in silence, toward the memories that once frightened you. The palace, once the site of your greatest constraints, became the keeper of your full story. Its hallways remembered your cautious footsteps. Its gardens remembered your quiet longing. Its opera box remembered your breath catching at the sight of someone who changed everything. And its windows, those tall, arched windows, now reflected a face softened not by defeat, but by endurance. You realized, in the end, that survival had not hardened you. It had deepened you. Your life was not defined by secrecy, but by the courage it took to protect your heart in a world that asked you to hide it. And now, in the gentle hush of old age, you could finally hold your story without fear. You could finally breathe without caution. You could finally let all the layers of your life settle into place, complicated, imperfect, beautiful, and maybe that was the greatest rebellion of all, not breaking the rules, but outliving them. And so, when we step back from each chapter, from the quiet mornings shaped by duty, the carefully chosen clothes, the watchful eyes of family, the silent loyalty of staff, the danger of gatherings, the secret language of romance, the weight of rumors, the fleeting escapes, the long nights of loneliness, and the final soft dawning of old age, we see a life that was never simple, never free, yet undeniably full, a life lived between lines, between glances, between expectations, a life shaped by restraint but sustained by an inner courage no one else ever witnessed. Every moment of concealment, every fragment of affection hidden in plain sight, every quiet rebellion stitched into the corners of a rigid world, became part of a story too complex to judge and too human to dismiss. What looked like elegance from the outside was, on the inside, a lifelong act of balancing truth and survival. What looked like privilege was often another form of confinement. And yet, through it all, the heart persisted soft, steady, hopeful. This entire journey reminds us that even in history's most polished rooms, behind its grand portraits and perfect ceremonies, lived people who felt deeply, feared quietly, and longed endlessly for connection. Their stories were not written in the official records. They were written in the spaces no one thought to look in: private notebooks, in unsent letters, in the silence of gardens at dawn. And perhaps the most profound truth is this: even when the world demanded perfection, their humanity still found a way to shine through. Not loudly, not boldly, but unmistakably. Thank you, everyone, for staying with me through this tender, hidden world, these quiet corridors of longing, survival, and unexpected grace. If this story touched something in you, or made you wonder how many untold histories still lie behind closed doors, then you are exactly where you are meant to be. I will see you in the next chapter. Take care, and stay curious.